policy away from endless war and toward rigorous diplomacy. We favor a national security strategy that is centered on diplomacy and military restraint. While most of attention has been given to the horrific war in Yemen, far less attention has been given to a war that is now entering its 7th year, that of the war in Yemen. President Biden came into office pledging to end this war and end his support for the Saudi-led effort there, yet it has become quite clear that he is not moving forward with that pledge. In the context of rising oil prices, Biden is even considering providing even more support for the Saudi and Emirati efforts and bombing campaigns in Yemen in return for a pledge from them to provide more oil and push down oil prices. Yet as recent events in the Middle East has demonstrated, America's partners in the Middle East are hedging despite the Biden administration's extensive support for them. They hope to strengthen their relationship with Moscow and Beijing while continuing to reap the benefits of Washington's largesse. Throughout this period, the US has been complicit in selling weapons and providing assistance without which the Saudis could not conduct their bombing campaigns. What is happening in Yemen right now? Why has the Biden administration reversed its position on ending the war? And what can be done to put an end to this war? To address these questions, we are delighted to be joined by a fantastic panel of experts. From The Intercept, we have Jeremy Scale. We have the founder of the Yemen Relief and Reconstruction, Aisha Juman. The Cato Institute's Justin Logan is with us as well. And of course, QI's own Anel Shilai. For those of you who are joining us via Zoom, you can use the Q&A function to ask questions. If you are watching it on YouTube, on Twitter, on Facebook, please write your questions in the comment section and we will try to get to those as well. I want to get straight into the conversation. So if you all don't mind, I'm not going to go over the longer biographies of our excellent experts. All of those can be found on the events page on the Quincy website. I'm going to go straight into it. So I'm going to first ask the question to Anel. Anel, you just published a brief that got quite a lot of attention that looks at the actual numbers of what actually has happened in the war. We hear a lot about how the Houthis have escalated. We're hearing less about the extent and the numbers of attacks conducted by the Saudi coalition. What do the numbers tell us of what has happened in the Yemen war since President Biden took office?
Thanks, Trita. Yeah, it's been really disheartening, unfortunately, over this past year because there had been so much optimism when Biden came into power that he would reverse the Obama era and Trump era policies of this unconditional support for what Saudi Arabia was doing. But unfortunately, over the past year, we've seen Biden essentially continuing this level of support and even increasing it. So specifically, there are 2 points I wanted to be sure to make that the Biden administration keeps reiterating. One is this notion that they are only providing support for defensive weapons, and they maintain that it is crucial for the United States to continue to defend our Arab partners, Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And so under this rubric that they justified $1 billion in new weapon sales, characterizing these weapons as defensive. And the point that I made in the brief was essentially that this is a meaningless distinction because to allow for the Saudis and Emiratis to better defend themselves, this gives them greater impunity to then attack Yemen. And when they face the consequences for those attacks in counterattacks from the Houthi rebels, they are able to deflect 90% of them with US assistance. And so the Biden administration continues to maintain this notion that the Saudis are under such dire threat from the Houthis. And we did just recently over the weekend see Houthi attacks on Saudi energy facilities and water facilities, which are regrettable. I'm not condoning these kinds of attacks, but the point is, when you look at the magnitude of what Saudi Arabia and the UAE are doing to Yemen, it is exponentially greater in terms of the civilian impact of the deaths directly from airstrikes, as well as the results of what these airstrikes do to the ability of Yemenis to have access to food and clean water and electricity and medical supplies. And whereas what the Houthis are able to do to Saudi Arabia, has resulted in the deaths of 59 people, which is unfortunate, but you compare that to the deaths of almost 400,000 Yemenis since this conflict started. And it's really just absurd when the Biden administration continually reiterates this notion that they're condemning the attacks by the Houthis. The Houthis are the real problem here. So this was a big part of what I was trying to show in the brief, was first this notion of the offensive-defensive distinction really breaks down. And then this notion that the Houthis are posing such a major threat, when in fact the numbers demonstrate that the real threat here are the Saudis and Emiratis, and the real victims are the Yemenis.
And now, what do the numbers then tell us in terms of the narrative that the Houthis have been escalating the conflict for the last year? Have they been escalating? Who have they been escalating against in that case? And is what the Saudis and Emiratis doing a counter-escalation, or is the picture a little bit more complex than that?
Right. So there's a crucial graphic here. I can post the link in the chat in a moment. But the Houthis have not escalated their attacks against Saudi Arabia. Again, the Houthis are conducting attacks within Yemen. These are horrific. All parties to the conflict are credibly accused of war crimes, including the United States. But in terms of what the Houthis are launching across the border at Yemen, again, 90% of which are deflected successfully, those have not escalated. Instead, we've seen a major uptick in the Saudi-led attacks, especially at the end of last year. Early this year was some of the highest spike in coalition airstrikes we've seen in years, in the past 4 years. And so clearly this is demonstrating that the Biden administration is not trying to end its support for Saudi offensive actions. We should have seen a decline in Saudi airstrikes if the Biden administration had actually ended support, because we know that the Saudi Air Force cannot fly without US assistance.
Thanks so much. Jeremy, tell us a little bit more about the history of this, because clearly this is not just something that is happening under Biden's watch or under Trump's watch or under Obama's watch. This is not a Republican Democrat issue. What is the history of the US involvement in this, and what is the relationship between this war and the broader global war on terror?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, this is just an utterly unconscionable history on the part of not just Saudi Arabia, but the United States. And, often what happens, and we're seeing this with regards to Ukraine as well, history and context are thrown out the door entirely. And US policymakers, the same is true of Saudi policymakers, pretend as though there is no history, there is no context, and that evil just popped out of a vacuum. In a way, we have a similar dynamic in our political system in the United States, particularly among Democrats, where it's like every new Republican administration that comes in is sort of the origin story of evil in the United States. This happened with Bush and Cheney, who I agree were particularly evil characters. In the case of Dick Cheney, he's a cartoonish villain and throughout his entire life. The same can be said of Donald Trump. There are many ways in which Donald Trump was a uniquely dangerous and uniquely bad president, but much of what Donald Trump did was within the parameters of the American imperial state when it came to foreign policy or national security policy. In the case of Yemen, the overwhelming majority of Americans certainly couldn't locate it on a map and don't know much about the history at all. In fact, one of the only pop cultural references to Yemen over the past 30 years was on a show that I didn't watch, but it was called Friends. And I watched this episode where one of the characters tries to escape from his girlfriend by lying to her and telling her that he's moving to Yemen. And there's a scene at the airport where she asks for his address and he says something like 2020 Yemen Way, Yemen. It basically, if it's happening in Yemen, generally speaking, it's not really happening. It's not getting serious media coverage. But Yemen is a very important country, not just now, but in the Arab world. And I think if you look at what happened just before 9/11, you had a very high-profile, deadly attack on a U.S. ship, the USS Cole, that was launched from Yemen using small ships, and it was one of the deadliest attacks, so-called peacetime attacks against a U.S. vessel, and I believe it killed more than a dozen or so U.S. personnel. The Bush administration then comes into power, and there already was a concerted effort on the part of Clinton and Bush to try to bring the perpetrators to justice, and so that was the main course of diplomatic discussions between the US and Yemen was over the issue of we need to bring the perpetrators of the bombing of the USS Cole to justice. 9/11 happens then. And Ali Abdullah Saleh, the very wily leader of a unified Yemen, was among the first leaders in the Arab world to try to reach out to Washington and say, hey, we're on your side. And Yemen was not a greatly important country. But what you see, the reason I'm going to lengths to sort of set this up, is that what you see from 2000, when the Cole is bombed, to 9/11, and then right up to the Obama administration, is Ali Abdullah Saleh, the leader of Yemen, trying to find a way to manipulate the United States using the context of the war on terror to leverage more counterterrorism funding that he can use officially to fight an al-Qaeda presence in Yemen, but actually to use that aid to try to wage his own domestic internal political battles. The WikiLeaks cables that were published throughout starting in 2010 and beyond provide a fascinating roadmap to what happened there. And relevant to our discussion is this, Trita. Francis Townsend and other Bush administration national security officials were dealing with Ali Abdullah Saleh, still on the issue of the USS Cole, but now about how are we going to fight al-Qaeda together. Repeated visits to Sanaa and vice versa happen. And the Bush administration starts to note that Saleh is saying the war against the Houthis, which he waged, the six wars throughout the 2000s, that it's the same as the war against al-Qaeda. It's the same as the war on terrorism. And then he gives this sort of, weird milkshake of rationales mixed up together where he's saying Iran is backing the Houthis and the Houthis are somehow working with al-Qaeda. And the Bush people, to their credit, sort of said, well, hold on a second. This is kind of nuts here, and they have to explicitly tell Ali Abdullah Saleh he is not to use U.S. counterterrorism assistance, weapons, etc., or the special units that the U.S. helped set up to fight al-Qaeda against the Houthis. Well, Saleh does that repeatedly. Obama takes power, and he's trying to move away from, he thought, were big-scale ground troop dumb wars. And he really empowers the Joint Special Operations Command and the CIA to take the lead, particularly in the Central Command arena. And one of the first strikes that Obama authorizes in this sort of new asymmetric warfare that he's embracing, that Bush had been dabbling in throughout the post 9/11 period, was in Yemen. In December of 2009, Obama initiates a secret air war in Yemen. And there had only been one drone strike in Yemen, and it was in 2002. And for 2002 to 2009, no known U.S. strikes. The Saudis had bombed a few times, but no U.S. strikes. December of 2009, Obama launches a secret strike using cruise missiles and cluster bombs. And it shredded 36 people into meat in the village of Al-Majla, the vast majority of them civilians, women, and children. The U.S. tried to lie and state that it wasn't a U.S. attack, and actually Ali Abdullah Saleh took public credit for it. A journalist goes to the scene, a Yemeni journalist takes pictures of the munitions. It was clear that it was an American strike. That began then the sort of floodgates opening for military strikes from the United States and ultimately Saudi Arabia. And I think that just to cap this point up, what is often left out of this is that it was during this crucial moment when Obama first came to power that the drone strikes were expanding, that the U.S. was bolstering its military cooperation with Saudi Arabia, that this could have been nipped in the bud, that it didn't need to go in this direction. And for a variety of factors at play, the Obama administration outsourced much of its foreign policy in Yemen to a very malignant actor in Saudi Arabia that is not just concerned with its own internal security or its border security, but actually is concerned with its proxy war against Iran. And so I would lay the blame for not recognizing the consequences of this at the foot of Obama and Biden starting the first year in their administration. They got played like a fiddle by the Saudis, and the Saudis have repeatedly given them bad intel, as Ali Abdullah Saleh did, that then the U.S. uses drone strikes to kill what they think are al-Qaeda people, and in fact, they're doing political hits for foreign actors.
Wow, Jeremy, you mentioned 36 or so innocent civilians that were killed in that first drone strike, and it brings it to the humanitarian impact of this war. The UN has repeatedly said that this is one of the worst, if not the worst, humanitarian catastrophes right now. Large number of refugees, starvation because of the blockade, as well as, of course, these massive war crimes that are committed, as Anel put it, all parties in this conflict. Aisha, can you tell us a little bit more about this humanitarian crisis? To what extent was that avoidable? To what extent is that not just a consequence of the military fighting, but consequence of the economic warfare that is being conducted through this blockade?
Yeah, thank you, Trita. Yemen, like you said, is the largest humanitarian crisis in the world based on the UN reports. We right now have about 17 million people in Yemen who are food insecure. 2.2 million of those are children, and we have 1.5 million women who are anemic, or pregnant women who are anemic. So the problem with what's going on is, in addition to the purposeful targeting of food sources in Yemen by the Saudi-led coalition and the destruction of anything that makes food, we also have a blockade that is imposed on Yemen ports, where food, not just fuel is not able to get in, but also we have food and medicine and essential goods are being prevented from getting in. According to the UN, there were about 40,000 containers that got into Hodeidah port in 2016. Now we have about 1,000 containers getting into Hodeidah port into 2021. And so anything that gets into Yemen has to get approval from the Saudis. Ships get diverted from Hodeidah to Jazan in Saudi Arabia and not allowed into Yemen. And these ships may stay months to years, and sometimes they actually leave because they've been waiting for too long. And of course, there are fees that are associated with this, and these fees, when they eventually go to Yemen, is then borne by the Yemeni people. So that, we have at least 500,000 Yemeni children today who are at risk of death within weeks to months. And all of this with the support of the US government. Every time we talk about the blockade, the US government initially didn't even want to acknowledge there is a blockade on Yemen. And now they talk about it, but they don't say that it's a Saudi, enforced. They continue to say that when aid gets into Yemen, that it gets diverted by the Houthis. My question to them, and I've always raised this point, is what is the root cause of the scarcity of food and essential items in Yemen? The root cause is the blockade and the destruction of the economic situation in Yemen. If items are readily available, then you remove the power of people to manipulate using those items because they are available. When they are scarce, then you give the people in power the ability to manipulate that. So I would say that the blockade is really the biggest killer of Yemeni people. We hear about that in Yemen, about 400,000 people have died to date. As an epidemiologist and as a public health professional, I would say this is a hugely underestimate because we don't have surveillance for mortality in Yemen. So a lot of people who are dying hungry are dying in their homes, and nobody knows about that.
What, Aisha, that's absolutely terrible. What do the Saudis think they are achieving with this blockade?
Unfortunately, the Saudis' strategy is very much, I think, what the Americans do all the time with sanctions, is that they punish the people of the country, hoping that these people will then try to change their leaders. We know this is a failed policy. By punishing the people of Yemen, they actually had strengthened the Houthis in Yemen. They did not weaken them. Because what people see is they see an attack on them, on their country. And so it's very hard for me to understand why the Saudis would want to starve millions of people in Yemen, hoping that these starved people will have any kind of power to change who is ruling them.
Justin, when you listen to this, I know you have written extensively about the importance of putting U.S. national interests at the center of decisions. When we hear, the history of this, how the Biden or the Obama administration got played into this, it really raises the question: what is the U.S.'s interest in this conflict that, in the terms of those who believe it, actually have necessitated not only a role but this specific role of the United States? And while we are as involved as we are right now, and we see an escalation that has taken place in the last year, are there tripwires that, unfortunately, if crossed, can bring the United States even deeper into the war rather than the opposite, getting the United States to not only pull itself out, but by doing so, help put an end to the war as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, those are great questions. I want to commend Anel for writing the paper and Quincy for holding this event, because, with apologies to the Washington Post, this war has gone on in darkness, right? If there were congressional hearings about this on a regular basis saying, what is it exactly that we're trying to achieve over there? How deeply entangled are we with the Saudis in this war? Do we want to be at the center of a Saudi-Iran proxy war in the Middle East? What are the stakes for us? I think this thing would suffer a lot. And I really enjoyed, if you can call it that, reading Anel's paper. I think that the U.S. does believe that it is at the center of a proxy war in the Middle East against Iran. I think if you look at the personnel, and Anel gets into this delicately in the paper, the people who are driving U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East at present have a long track record of viewing Iran as the sort of root of all evil in the Middle East, and viewing the Houthis as a sort of cat's paw for Iran, not as a more or less independent actor, which has alliances of convenience here and there with Iran. So in the context of this, looking at this issue more broadly, the American interest that would be required in order to make us a party to the appalling humanitarian catastrophe that is the war in Yemen would have to be immense. There would have to be national survival at stake, or something just immensely important for the United States to immiserate and kill hundreds of thousands of people, immiserating tens of millions of people. And to my mind, there's nothing close to that exists in this context. If you look at the Middle East generally as an entire region, it's between 3.5% of world GDP, even including oil, and between 3 and 5% of world population. This is not the sort of industrial heartland of Europe in the 1930s or something like this, where you could say this would have immense consequences if the balance tipped this way or that for the United States. So I think that scrutinizing these rationales is immensely important for getting at an end game here, right? What we should be looking at is some way to stop this war. And I think if you look at it, even from Saudi's strategic perspective, this has been an immense blunder executed poorly. And I think that, if we want to talk about parallels to Ukraine, the Russian war there has been an immense blunder executed poorly. And I think that, we really should be calling the Saudis out on this rather than just smiling and nodding and allocating more American attention to the problem.
So on that last point, we should be calling out the Saudis on this. What do you think is holding the administration back? And I want to bring in Anel and Jeremy on this as well, when it comes to oil prices and other things that the administration may be fearing that the Saudis have leverage over the United States for. Justin, starting off with you.
Well, one relevant fact that Anel also points out in the paper, right, is that, we went in really deep to this thing in the hope of buying Saudi acquiescence to the Iran nuclear deal. And we all remember the great payoff that we got for our entanglement in the war in that sense. So I think you hear, we talked about this a little bit yesterday, the idea that, in exchange for our assistance, the oil for security, if you will, the Saudis will turn the dials on oil production. This is just the most ahistorical view that I've ever heard of. I've had the misfortune of having to talk to some energy economists about this problem. And they say about the sort of foreign policy consensus on how we can produce change in production, they say, people actually believe this? They think that the Saudis are making production decisions based on this or that in treaty from the United States. And there's, a going on 50-year history of this belief in the strategic studies community that energy economists say, you guys are cuckoo. What do you think about this? This isn't the way anything works. So it's been, immensely depressing in that sense to hear people say, we're going to get Saudi buy-in for the JCPOA, or we're going to get the Saudis to, make gas prices go down. That's not how any of this works.
Jeremy, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I would sort of challenge the framing of that question a bit. I think now we're at a point. If we say that this ultimately started in terms of the U.S. role in 2009, we're looking at more than a decade now of fairly consistent U.S. policy with some tinkering around the edges. The killing, the brutal murder of Khashoggi open this window where the people like Chris Murphy and Ro Khanna and others who had really been pushing for a full-throated confrontation of Saudi Arabia had sort of their day in court, and they even got people like Lindsey Graham, to sort of pay some lip service to the idea that we need to put Saudi Arabia, in a corner for a while. But at some point, when you're talking about Obama, Biden, and then you have Trump, and then you have Biden again, and the policy largely remains the same, we need to stop talking about the U.S. as sort of the adult who's trying to get the Saudis to stop murdering people on a mass scale. At some point, we have to say, this is the U.S. policy. The U.S. policy prioritizes its relationship with a corrupt dictatorship run by lunatics, butchers, and murderers over the humanitarian catastrophe that the U.S. was the igniter of, through its policy. And I'm sorry, if Biden wanted this to end, he could end it. He could end it. You look at, setting aside we could have a whole debate about Ukraine, but what we are seeing right now with Biden's rhetoric, with the NATO rhetoric, is that when these Western countries want to go after another nation state and the head of the state, they can use the full power of their propaganda, of their media, of their diplomatic alliances, of their economic power to send a serious message. The irony of the debate over a no-fly zone with Ukraine is that we could make a plausible argument with no nuclear implications whatsoever that there should be an immediate no-fly zone over Yemen. But who would enforce that no-fly zone? Is the U.S. going to stop its own funded aircraft and munitions? No. So, I mean, it is at some point we need to own the fact that this is U.S. policy, that at some high level, they've made a calculation that it's fine to have hundreds of thousands of Yemenis being murdered with the support of the U.S. government. We need to stop pretending that the U.S. is somehow the adult that is going to talk sense to Saudi Arabia. If Biden wanted it over, he could end it.
So, Jeremy, let me play devil's advocate a little bit and shift the question to Anel and to Aisha. Let's assume that there actually is a desire to end the war, that when Biden said that he wanted to end the war, he was serious, but that other complicating factors are coming in and making the mess that we see right now. One of the things that advocates of the administration's policy say is that they can't really get to an end to the war because the Houthis are refusing to negotiate. And as long as that is not taking place, the Houthis not backing down or giving some concessions or giving some sort of a compromise, the war will continue. And what we've seen in the last couple of months is that there's been an escalation by the Saudi and Emirati coalition with support of the United States, which at least quietly people are saying, well, this is aimed at kind of creating a new situation that would force the Houthis to come to the table. That's the narrative, that's the talking point. Would that work? And if it hasn't worked, why isn't it working? And is there actually perhaps a much better way to get to a negotiated settlement? Aisha, you first, and then Anel.
So we've heard from the administration that the Saudis are ready to negotiate peace in Yemen. However, when you hear the Saudi foreign minister speaking, he's conditioning the peace negotiation on two things. One, UN Security Council Resolution 2216 that asks that the Houthi surrender to the coalition, which is not going to happen. And by the way, UN Security Council 2216 was drafted by the US, hoping that Russia was going to veto it. They did not think that resolution was going to pass. And that brings me to another point, is why are we giving Russia the power or to bail us when we don't want to say something publicly? So basically, they wrote a bad UN Security Council resolution, thinking that Russia was going to bail them by vetoing it. Russia didn't veto it, and it passed, and it basically says the Houthis have to surrender. The second condition that the Saudis always come up with is that the Gulf Initiative, the Gulf Council Initiative, that also excludes completely both the Houthis and the STC, the Southern Transitional Council, from any governing coalition in Yemen. So we have two conditions that the Houthis are not going to come to, and the U.S. government knows that. The second part of it is the Houthis have, actually went to negotiations several times in Kuwait and in Sweden, and nothing happened. Right now, what they're saying, and they've said that quite a few times, is that one, the blockade has to be lifted before any negotiations can take place. And I actually agree with that, because we cannot hold the Yemeni people hostages to any negotiation that may take years. So these are the two positions that they, in terms of what the Saudi and the US government are at, and what the Houthis are responding to them. So there is, if they are serious, the blockade is lifted, then there is a chance for everybody to sit on the table and all Yemenis to form a coalition government. And that was actually achieved under bin Umar, just before, a few days before the Saudi launched their attack on Yemen in 2015, in which the Houthis at that point in time were going to get 20% of government positions, or while the other members were going to get enough seats for everybody, and everybody was included. What they were discussing at that point in time is where they were going to be signing this agreement when the Houthis 2 days later started launching attacks while bin Umar was still in Sanaa.
But doesn't this then presume, Aisha, that there is an openness on the Houthi side to share power, to be part of a coalition government, which seems to run counter to the narrative that we are being told, which is, they're going out for a maximalist victory, and they will only negotiate if they're starting to suffer significant losses on the battlefield.
If you read any of their publication, or if you hear any of their statements, they've never said that. Actually, both the STC and the Houthis were totally excluded from any governing positions, immediately after Ali Abdullah Saleh was left office under the Gulf Initiative. So they've always fought for a seat on the table. They never fought to be, in full control of Yemen. And there was an article actually that was published in 2015 talking about the failed Gulf Council initiative, because it did exclude a lot of people. And there is going to be no peace in Yemen until everybody sits together. And when Yemenis sit together, actually, they do reach agreements. So I'll take an example of swaps of prisoners. When the Yemenis sit together without the interference of the Saudis and the Emiratis, they actually swap prisoners. Every time the Saudis get in, those agreements never happen. So the Yemen has been a country for thousands of years. They have traditions that actually help them resolve conflicts. And when they sit together, they must always reach a consensus. Not everybody is happy with them, but at least it's compromises. But when the Saudis get in, those compromises don't happen.
Interesting. And I want to hear your take on that as well, and on the idea of, could the Houthis even govern all of Yemen on their own? Or is that an impossibility that in and of itself would force them to have to share power? And also, if you can address one thing, we have said a lot about the Saudi role here. One thing that seems to fly under the radar is the role of the United Arab Emirates. And though they never really left the war, they had a lower profile in the war, they still occupied some islands of Yemen, but then they re-engaged earlier last year, which is part of the reason why we later on saw Houthi attacks at Abu Dhabi. Why did the Emiratis suddenly go back into this conflict in a very active way? And is that going to be sustained, or are they potentially going to pull out again? I know.
Well, to the question of whether the Houthis could consolidate control, that would be very difficult for them, given they are Zaydi Shia and large parts of Yemen are Sunni, and it simply the history of independence among Yemeni tribes who are all very well armed, they would resist control by the Houthis. But at the moment, it's sort of similar to what we saw in Afghanistan, where you had people who didn't necessarily want to be controlled by the Taliban, but eventually, especially in rural Afghanistan, people decided they would rather sort of deal with the realities of Taliban control than continue to be killed by US bombs falling. And so similarly, in Yemen, there are people who don't necessarily want the Houthis to be in charge, but at the moment, they're willing to perhaps fight alongside them or to offer just general support because they are experiencing this foreign aggression, which is such a common dynamic that you have an awful actor. Again, the Houthis conduct atrocities. But the question here is not really, we're not debating who should end up being in control of Yemen. The point is, why is the US weighing in with such extreme levels of support for what the Saudis and Emiratis are doing? And as Justin said, what interests do we really have here to justify our complicity in this horrific humanitarian debacle? But to answer that, I think it's important to keep in mind that the calculation that Biden administration seems to have made has to do with Russia and China. And there's this notion that we have to hang on to our Gulf security partners even harder because we're so worried that they may turn to Russia or to China and that the US would no longer have these very wealthy customers for all of our weapons purchases. You know, Saudi Arabia is the biggest customer of US weapons. Also in the brief, we can see graphics in particular of the massive amounts of weapons the Obama administration sold to the Saudis. More recently, we've seen a huge uptick following the Abraham Accords of American weapons sales to the UAE. And just to get to your question on that, Trita, so yes, the UAE had been one of the original members of the Saudi-led Arab coalition that launched its intervention almost exactly 7 years ago. But eventually the PR got to be too bad. There was a lot of congressional pushback, especially under Trump, as Jeremy mentioned, following sort of the murder of Khashoggi and the media uproar around that really opened this opportunity to point out what the Saudis were doing in Yemen and how intolerable that was. But since then, that has closed down. We haven't necessarily seen that same amount of public outcry. And there are a couple questions from audience members asking, why are we not seeing more about this? And I think a big part of that has to do with geography, the fact that we are not having Yemeni refugees showing up in Turkey or on the borders of Europe, the way we saw with refugees from Syria and elsewhere during the so-called refugee crisis in around 2014 and 2015. And again, you know, we know that American and European white audiences are much more likely to sort of experience empathy when they see fellow white Ukrainians experiencing this level of violence, that white audiences simply have not historically shown to Syrians or Afghans or Libyans or Yemenis. And however, just one point here before we move on, that there is something that people can do. At the moment, Congress has committed, or two members of Congress, Tafazio and Jayapal, have committed to reintroducing a Yemen War Powers Resolution. This actually passed in 2019 to end US support for the war, and Trump vetoed it. And so there's this effort to do it again. But it is an uphill battle because we are seeing, especially folks, Democrats who were very outspoken about this under Trump, apparently willing to let Biden do many of the same sorts of things and to not raise the same kind of opposition. So if there's anything that I would like people to take away from this, it's that call your member of Congress and tell them to support a Yemen war powers resolution, which will be forthcoming.
So,
can I just add one? Can I add one thing to that,
Sure.
Trita? Sorry. I agree with what Anel is saying, and I do think very clearly the color of the skin of refugees and racist tendencies are a huge part of this story. I mean, it's horrifying to see the double standard, not just applied toward Yemenis, but also that was applied toward Iraqis. Or Syrians, particularly under Donald Trump, when the sort of quiet parts got said out loud constantly by that man on Twitter and elsewhere. But also, who is the aggressor in this case matters, and that also is like the United States invades Iraq and causes a massive, not just bloodshed campaign of mass murder and collective punishment and shock and awe, but also a huge refugee crisis. And imagine if the same standards now being applied to not just Russian officials, but to Russian athletes, Russian artists, Russian others. If the whole world united and responded to the United States that way with boycotts, cancellation of athletes and musicians, etc., but also on questions of refugees. Oh my God, the United States in this bald act of aggression has caused this massive humanitarian catastrophe and the world needs to take in these refugees. In the case of Yemen, we are, if not the greatest, one of the greatest constant ongoing drivers of this horrifying reality. So it's like we are causing the problem, and then we say, "Oh, we're going to step in and take the refugees." It would be an indictment of the U.S. policy to even acknowledge that we have a moral responsibility to take Yemeni refugees, or to staunch the bleeding, or to stop the killing. So it's not just about who the victims are, and I agree 100%. There is a complete racist element to this. There's an Islamophobic element to it, but it's much easier to condemn the Putins of the world than it is the Trumps, the Bidens, or the Bushes of the world.
Thank you, Jeremy. And on that point,
to add to that,
go ahead.
It just in terms of what Jeremy said and what Anel said, is how we demonize our enemies. And in the Middle East, we have demonized Iran to the point where any association with Iran is seen as catastrophic, but also in terms of the relationship between Russia and China with Iran, the Saudis and the Emiratis are not asking those two countries to cut their relationship with Iran so that they have a relationship with them like they do with the US. And that's something that I think we also need to be discussing.
Got it. It's a good point. And I wanted to bring in Justin into one aspect, because Jeremy is talking about it on a broader scale, as did Anel, and many people in the audience did ask about this, and perhaps also talking a little bit why the media treats it differently. Justin, tell us why think tanks have tended to treat this so differently. I'm going to make you the representative of the entire blog right now. Go ahead.
Look, I think, we started this movie in the middle. We've been at this sort of on again, off again conflict in the Middle East with Iran since 1979, right? And it's heated up and bubbled down. But people who have spent careers working on U.S. policy in the Middle East, people older than me even, that is the entire framework for how you view the Middle East. And so if everything is about the pull and haul of this might be good for Iran or this might be bad for Iran, that lubricates a lot of these policies that otherwise, standing or falling on their own, they couldn't do. So if you take a couple of premises, one, the Middle East is of vital importance strategically to the United States, and two, that Iran is the singular central locus of opposition to U.S. interests in the Middle East, then this whole story gets going pretty easily. But if you do what, non-blobby types or anti-blobby types like I do and say, let's take a step back and figure out what it actually is that we need from the Middle East and how hard it is to get those things, It's not hard to get them. And in many cases, if you look, for example, at, oil, that is a problem that is not helped by U.S. military exertion in the Middle East. And as we've seen over and over again, from sanctioning Iraqi oil, attacking Iraq, we wind up doing things that are deleterious to oil consumers over the world. We're driving the prices up while we're telling ourselves what we're actually doing is driving them down. So I think it's an entire cast of mind that affects Mass Ave here, where I'm sitting right now, where everything is shaped around countering Iran. And we even heard, with respect to the discussion over the nuclear deal, this discussion, and you never really usually hear these terms in Washington, D.C., Iran was going to become a regional hegemon. Right? It was going to be, in the Middle East, what the United States is in the Western Hemisphere. This is crazy stuff. Nobody should believe this. Nobody should even, Lindsey Graham shouldn't say it, but he does. And so if the political cast of mind that obtains in Washington think tanks conscripts you into doing things like this. And it's a grotesque tragedy.
The other thing is we have the ongoing constant discussion about Trump-Russia collusion, and I'm sure everyone here remembers this because we all follow this part of the story carefully. But there was a very solid evidentiary trail about Trump collusion with Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Israel to really ratchet up the rhetoric and action on Iran. And I think we don't have enough time to get into all of this, but there is I think a very serious argument to be made that US and Saudi policy ultimately drove the Houthis into a much closer partnership with Iran. Iran had a very difficult time in actively penetrating on a deep strategic level the Houthi leadership. Yes, there was the similar slogans, "Death to America," and there were all sorts of cultural and media cooperation, and there was some military cooperation on a covert level between Iran and the Houthis. But the reason at the beginning I cited the WikiLeaks cables on Bush administration officials is that the Bush people seem to actually understand that Ali Abdullah Saleh was overstating the role of Iran in Yemen in an effort to draw the United States and potentially Saudi Arabia in on a deeper level. What I think US policy, Saudi policy, and certainly the legacy of Saleh has created is an opening that may not have ever existed but for our role for Iran to come in and start playing a more active role. And it was in the very early months of the Trump administration, particularly when Michael Flynn, in his brief, star turn as the national security advisor, there was that famous press conference where he comes out and he's wearing the JetBlue tie, like he was a flight attendant on JetBlue. And he basically makes an extremely belligerent threat to Iran that has to do with attacks off the coast of Yemen. I think that there is a vital course of inquiry to look at the ways in which we created the very threat or problem that the U.S. and Saudi Arabia claim to be fighting in Yemen. Facts and history matter, and they're not really in vogue these days in Washington, Brussels, or Riyadh.
Jeremy, I think what you're saying is really interesting. I want to bring in Aisha onto that specific issue, but I want to kind of take it one step further. It is one thing to be able to point out, as Jeremy, I think, quite correctly did, that where Iran's relations is with the Houthis and its influence in Yemen today, it's quite different from what it was 10 years ago. And the big factor there is the Saudi attack on Yemen. But what exactly is that influence nevertheless? Because even saying that it is greater than it was 10 years ago may still exaggerate what that influence is in more clear terms.
Just briefly to say, I think it was virtually non-existent for let's say from 9/11 all the way through early stages of the Obama administration. I know from my reporting on the ground that there were some during this period that there were some attempts of Houthi figures to try to get military cooperation from Iran, but it was basically just a nothing burger. It wasn't really happening. There was a lot of aspiration and talk, and as Aisha pointed out earlier, there are other dynamics at play beyond whether you're Shia or Sunni, you're Zaidi, or in Yemen, that have to do with the way that various tribes, people that control various regions, negotiate with one another. They have long-standing conflict. And Saleh was so brilliant at playing these factions off of each other. It's not that religion is irrelevant or not a major factor. I guess the point that I'm making is that Iran probably would have liked to have come in a more effective way much earlier to Yemen. And because of Yemeni tribal and just national culture, it just wasn't plausible. And I think that to this day, Iran's role is dramatically overstated. What I'm saying, Trita, is that there are doors that have been opened where the Houthis themselves feel that they need to find foreign partners willing to help them. I'm not implying that there's now this pipeline from Iran. Sure, I'm saying that our own actions have created a greater urgency that didn't exist before for both Iran and the Houthis because of this coalition that is mounting with a very aggressive stance toward Tehran.
Got it. And what then is that relationship right now, Aisha? So for instance, can a Saudi-Iranian deal help put an end to the war in Yemen? Or is that a fantasy that is premised on the idea that the Iranians control the Houthis?
I also want to go back to history, to one instance when Sada was being bombed by the Saudis and the Iranian government sent money for reconstruction. The Houthis returned that money. They didn't want anything from Iran. And a lot of people are not talking about this. So, and even when they had an ambassador in Sanaa, and he passed away now, his movements in Sanaa were extremely restrictive. He couldn't go anywhere he wanted unless he had approval from the people in Sanaa. So even if Iran and Saudi Arabia become the best of friends, there's going to be not a lot of influence on Yemen because the Houthis are extremely independent. There is, they do have cooperation, but they're not going to be taking orders from anyone, and the least Iran. And there have been a lot of times when Iranian officials would say something in the media to show that they have some influence, and immediately you will have, leaders from the Houthi movement in Sanaa contradicting those statements from the Iranian government. So, Iran, unfortunately, part of this is exaggerated. And however, I do think the US government knows that. And I agree with Jeremy that the WikiLeaks had shown that they knew from early on that Iran doesn't have a huge hand in Yemen and does not even today have a huge hand. But that's just an excuse that is being used because, again, Iran had been demonized. And like Justin had said, everything in our foreign policy centers around how do we not get Iran any breathing room, actually. So if you just say you're fighting Iran anywhere, you're going to get a lot of people support you.
Sticking to history, right now, and I see a lot of folks in the question and answer have asked questions about Ukraine, and we're going to get to that at the end. But there's talk right now. Yesterday, Blinken said that they've seen evidence for war crimes committed by the Russians there and want to see an investigation. The war in Yemen has been going on for 7 years. What is the history of efforts to actually have independent investigations of what is taking place in that war? And where have those efforts led? And if they have not led anywhere, or if they have been stopped, by who and why? Both Aisha and Jeremy, if you want to come in on that.
So I'm going to start on that because I know in 2015 and 2016, the Dutch government proposed to the UN, establishing an independent international war crime investigations. In both years, those didn't go anywhere because the US government and the UK actually opposed them. And that continued up to last year when the UN Security Council voted against having the UN war crime investigation in Yemen. And this was done because the Saudi lobbied against it, unfortunately, and they even threatened the government like Indonesia, who is the largest Muslim country in the world, that if they voted for it, then the Indonesians could not go to Hajj in Mecca. So there's been concerted efforts by the US government, by the Saudis, to not support any independent international investigations of war crimes in Yemen. They continue to give the Saudis the chance to investigate their own crimes in Yemen. And here I want to talk about the hospitals being bombed in Yemen. The Saudis had bombed 4 MSF hospitals in Yemen, including a cholera center on the day that it was going to be opened. And Yemen had the largest cholera outbreak recorded in history. And every time the Saudis were given a chance to investigate themselves, and as they also do with the US government when it bombs civilian infrastructures and investigates itself, they always come saying that they did not commit any crimes. However, there are a lot of reports by Human Rights Watch and by Amnesty documenting war crimes committed in Yemen. The Saudi made the whole governorate of Sada, a whole state in Yemen, a military target. And they said that publicly and targeted it, and with their airstrikes, was that every single case in that governorate was a military target.
Jeremy, do you see that same pattern over 3 administrations?
Yeah, I mean, also, again, just to take it back, because I'm an American, and I believe that my primary responsibility is to hold my own government responsible. The United States itself is the chief underminer in the world of courts of international justice. The U.S., like Russia, refuses to subject its own personnel or officials to international courts. And actually, George Bush signed into law what many people called the Hague Invasion Act, which remains on the books and actually authorizes U.S. military forces to conduct an operation in The Hague to liberate any American personnel or officials who would be brought there for a war crimes trial. So how can the U.S. credibly call for others to be prosecuted for war crimes, not just when it doesn't hand its own personnel over or subject them to it, but won't even ratify the treaty that would enshrine a court of international justice? The same goes for the ban on cluster bombs. The United States is not a signatory to the cluster bomb ban and has actually used them in Yemen under Obama and Trump and sold them to the Saudis. So, we can talk about this, and I'm sure at some point there will be some ad hoc tribunal that will take a very narrow look at some of these issues. That's the preferred course of justice when it comes to war crimes that the United States prefers, rather than a universally applied set of principles and jurisdiction. So, Americans can do their own work on this by agitating that we actually hold ourselves to the standard we want to use for others around the world. And it would make a much stronger case for prosecuting the Putins or the MBSs of the world.
So throughout this conversation, we've had a lot of comparisons to what is happening in Ukraine. I want to give everyone a chance to just give a quick 30-second reflection on why it is that it is so different the way it's being covered. But at the same time, what are the similarities between Yemen and Ukraine that potentially can be helpful towards bringing an end to this conflict? I want to start off with Anel.
So the similarities are, the much more powerful neighboring state launching this unprovoked war of aggression that is primarily aimed at the civilian population. And the major difference being that in the case of Ukraine, there is this concern that if the US responds too aggressively, we could be starting World War III. Whereas in contrast, in Yemen, the US really could end Saudi Arabia's ability to conduct this air war on Yemen and to maintain this horrifying blockade. What the difference there is we don't see the same kind of American public outcry about Yemen that we're seeing in Ukraine. So again, I would just make a push for if this matters to you, whether Ukraine or Yemen, you can do something about it. You can call your member of Congress and tell them to support the Yemen War Powers Resolution.
Justin.
There we are. Sorry. We have this perverse inversion about sins of omission versus sins of commission. And I think we've rendered our garments more about not having done more in Ukraine to head off Russia than we have about what we are fueling and enabling in Yemen just over a 30-day war versus over a 7-year war. It's almost like this, philosophical hypothetical about killing versus letting die, except the other way round. And I find it just to be, kind of obscene, really. And I'm a white guy, and it pains me somewhat to concede this, but it's very difficult to push back the idea that race is happening here, and just the sort of mindset of the American public that this is just the normal state of affairs in the Middle East. Somebody's always killing somebody over there, and Europe is this sort of postmodern continent, and so it's rude for Putin to ruin that. And this is just, whereas in the Middle East, this is just the way it goes. It's very difficult to try to explain that away, and I'm not going to try.
Jeremy.
I mean, I think the power of storytelling, the stories of people who are forced to live under bombs or on the other side of the barrel of the gun pointed by the powerful at the disempowered, is a point that we should all pause and reflect on. The way that the stories of so many refugees fleeing their homes in Ukraine are being reported on should be a model for how the stories of Yemenis are reported. And I think that there are many factors as to why the plight and the fate of hundreds of thousands of dead Yemenis and millions of suffering Yemenis don't receive the same level of attention. But to look at things in a sort of positive way, I think we can say, let's take this great work that is being done in telling the stories of ordinary people and make that the standard, regardless of the nationality of the victims, regardless of the nationality or the flag of the perpetrators. And to me, that is really one of the great disconnects here, is that I think we all can be unified in stating that what Putin has ordered his military forces to do in Ukraine is unforgivable, unconscionable, is a complete mass crime. It's easy to say that about foreign leaders. When we have to face those realities of our own policies, that's where principle is actually tested. How we apply those standards to our own leaders says a lot about who we are as a nation. So I would take those lessons of good coverage of the suffering of other humans, but also the notion of levels of accountability. People who are calling for Putin to be tried for war crimes need to also reflect on our own history and the role of our leaders and the wars of aggression we've waged.
Thank you, Jeremy. Aisha, last word to you.
Yeah, it's the media coverage, like Jeremy said. It's the media coverage of the Ukraine versus Yemen. That's the biggest difference to me. And that's driven by our policy, US policy, by our media, what they think is important, but also is driven by PR firms and a lot of think tanks and a lot of lobbyists. The Saudi and the Emiratis put a lot of money into lobbying in the US. And again, we have the State Department, every time they speak on behalf of the Saudis, their statements sound like they came out from the Foreign Ministry of Saudi Arabia. So when you are talking about that, that's the big difference, is we have a government that's supporting one aggression, and we see how they behave when they are opposing another aggression. So I hope, and the US, unfortunately, there is no international body that can hold it accountable to what it's doing. However, the American public can hold our government accountable and insist that they end their support for the war in Yemen and have international standards that applied everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of you. And if I could just add one word, echoing what Jeremy said earlier on, and I think what all of you have reflected upon as well, which is that as horrible as the war in Ukraine is, and as important as it is to put an end to that war, and hopefully it will be ended very, very soon, there is a difference in the sense of the ease in which we can put an end to the war in Yemen by simply stopping supporting it to continue. There's a huge difference there, and I think it's important to emphasize. With that, I want to thank all of you. Thank you to Anel, to Justin, to Jeremy, to Aisha for participating. My apologies that we went on 5 minutes longer, but it was an amazing conversation, and hopefully a lot of it will be able to be used and inspire people to help bring an end to this war as well as to other wars. A big thank you to all of you in the audience. If you have not yet, please go to quincyinst.org, sign up for our newsletters. You will get notification of all of our publications, such as NL's recent report on Yemen, to webinars such as this one, as well as looking and seeing the future panels that we will be having in the next coming weeks and months. With that,